Three legends gathered at that party: the deadly beauty Elizabeth Taylor, the ice-cold Alain Delon, and the silently waiting Richard Burton. By the end of that night, someone would be shattered. The Beverly Hills mansion glittered like a diamond against the California darkness. Aaron Spelling's annual party was legendary, the kind of event where studio heads made billion-dollar deals over champagne, where careers were born and destroyed between the appetizer course and dessert. March 15, 1973. The who's who of Hollywood packed into rooms designed to impress kings. Elizabeth Taylor arrived fashionably late, as always. At 41, she was still breathtaking violet eyes that had launched 1,000 magazine covers. A figure that made grown men forget their own names. But those who knew her well could see the cracks. The drinking. The pills. The constant warfare with Richard Burton that had turned their legendary love story into Hollywood's most public battlefield. Burton followed 3 steps behind, as he always did now. Sullen. Brooding. Playing the role of the brilliant Welsh actor trapped in a marriage that had become performance art. They divorced the year before, remarried months later, and were now in the process of destroying each other all over again. It was their favorite game. "Darling, you look absolutely radiant," someone gushed at Elizabeth. She smiled that million-dollar smile, but her eyes were already scanning the room. Hunting. For what, she wasn't sure yet. Revenge? Attention? Something to make Burton's jaw clench that particular way that meant she'd do one another round in their endless war. That's when she saw him. Alain Delon stood near the terrace doors, holding a glass of champagne he wasn't drinking. 37 years old and still the most beautiful man anyone had ever seen. The Leopard, Le Samurai, Borzellino, a string of European masterpieces that had made him the king of continental cinema. But Hollywood had never quite known what to do with him. Too European, too sophisticated, too dangerous for American audiences who preferred their leading men more digestible. He was alone, which was unusual. Delon rarely attended Hollywood parties, and when he did, he was usually surrounded by admirers. Tonight he seemed content to observe from the margins, those ice-blue eyes taking in the circus with something between amusement and disdain. Elizabeth felt something stir in her chest. Not attraction, she'd felt that for dozens of men. This was something else. Recognition, perhaps. The way one predator recognizes another. Who is that exquisite creature? She asked her companion, though she already knew. Alain Delon, French. Very intense, of course. Elizabeth had always had a weakness for Europeans, their sophistication, their mystery. The way they made American men seem crude and obvious by comparison. She glanced back at Burton, who was holding court near the bar, regaling a group of producers with one of his famous anecdotes about working with Olivier. He hadn't noticed her looking at Delon yet, but he would. That was the point. Elizabeth Taylor had been playing power games since she was 12 years old, and MGM had signed her to her first contract. She understood the rules better than anyone. In Hollywood, attention was currency, and jealousy was the highest form of flattery. If she wanted to hurt Burton really hurt him, she needed to find someone who represented everything he wasn't. Someone younger. Someone more beautiful. Someone who didn't need Hollywood's approval to know his own worth. Someone like Alain Delon. She started walking across the room, her hips moving in that calculated way that had made her famous. Conversations paused as she passed. Heads turned. The entire party seemed to reorganize itself around her gravitational pull. Delon saw her coming. Of course he did. Men like Alain Delon always saw everything. He set down the champagne and waited, his face showing nothing. No eagerness. No fear. No reaction at all. Which made him even more intriguing. "You're Alain Delon," she said when she reached him. Not a question. A statement delivered in that famous voice that had whispered to presidents and kings. I'm Elizabeth Taylor. I know. 2 sentences. But the air between them was electric now. The kind of electricity that made photographers rich and gossip columnists giddy with anticipation. From across the room, Richard Burton's voice faltered mid-sentence. He'd noticed. But Elizabeth didn't yet know that Burton was watching everything. Elizabeth moved closer to Delon, close enough that he could smell her perfumes, something expensive and intoxicating that probably cost more than most people made in a year. She was testing him, seeing if he would step back, give ground, show weakness like so many men did when faced with her legendary presence. Delon did not move, did not flinch. Just stood there with those pale eyes studying her face like she was a puzzle he was considering whether to solve. "You know," she said, her voice carrying that famous breathiness that had made her the highest-paid actress in the world. Seen all your films. Purple Noon was extraordinary. Thank you. 2 words. Nothing more. Most men would have launched into stories about the making of the film, about working with Renee Clement, about how they prepared for the role. Delon just acknowledged the compliment and waited to see what she really wanted. It was infuriating and intoxicating. Elizabeth Taylor was accustomed to men who melted in her presence, politicians who stammered, directors who lost their train of thought. Even Burton, in the beginning, had been tongue-tied around her. But this French actor seemed completely immune to her charms, which made her want him more. "I am surprised to see you here," she continued, stepping even closer. "Hollywood parties are not usually your, scene? They are not." Delon glanced around the room filled with executives and starlets and social climbers. "But sometimes one makes exceptions." "For what?" "Curiosity." The word hung between them like smoke. Elizabeth felt a thrill run down her spine. When was the last time a man had made her feel like she was being hunted instead of doing the hunting? Across the room, Richard Burton was no longer telling his story. He was watching. Elizabeth could feel his gaze like heat on her back, could sense his growing anger even from 50 feet away. Good, let him watch. Let him see what it felt like to be ignored, to be dismissed, to be made to feel insignificant. "And what are you curious about?" she asked Delon. "American behavior, American relationships." The way he said relationships made it clear he was not talking about friendship. Elizabeth laughed, a sound like silver bells that made heads turn throughout the room. "Well, you have certainly come to the right place to study that. Hollywood relationships are quite educational, so I have observed. Have you?" She tilted her head, studying his perfect profile. "And what have you observed about mine?" It was a bold question. Everyone in Hollywood knew about Elizabeth and Richard. Their passionate love affair that had scandalized the world when they were both married to other people. Their explosive fights that could be heard 3 blocks away. Their divorce and remarriage that had become tabloid legend. "I have observed that you are a woman who enjoys games," Delon said quietly. The observation hit like a slap. Not because it was cruel, it was delivered without judgment, almost clinically. But because it was true, and because most people were too intimidated or too dazzled to say it out loud. "Do I?" she asked, her voice dropping to that husky whisper that had seduced senators and sultans. "Yes, and I have observed that your husband does not enjoy losing them." Elizabeth followed his gaze across the room to where Burton stood. Her husband was no longer pretending to socialize. He was staring directly at them now, his face dark with an emotion that went beyond simple jealousy. Richard Burton was one of the most intelligent men she had ever known, and right now that intelligence was calculating something dangerous. "Richard is not my concern at the moment," she said, turning back to Delon. "Perhaps he should be. Why? Are you afraid of him?" Delon smiled then, the first real expression she had seen from him all evening. It was not a pleasant smile. It was the smile of a man who had never been afraid of anything in his life. "No, but you should be afraid of what you are starting." "And what am I starting?" "A war you cannot win." The words should have been a warning. Should have made her step back, reconsider, choose a safer game with lower stakes. Instead, they thrilled her. Because Elizabeth Taylor had been fighting wars her entire life, against studios, against critics, against rivals, against time itself, and she had won every single one. "Watch me," she said. She reached out and placed her hand on his arm. A simple gesture that looked innocent enough from across the room. But up close, her fingers were tracing patterns on his sleeve, a touch that was anything but casual. "There is a garden behind the house," she murmured. "Very private, very quiet." Delon looked down at her hand on his arm, then back up at her face. For a moment, she thought he would refuse. That European sophistication would win out over basic male desire. Instead, he nodded once, almost imperceptibly. 5 minutes, he said. Elizabeth smiled a smile of pure victory and walked away. She did not look back at Burton. Did not acknowledge the 50 pairs of eyes watching her move through the crowd. She simply glided toward the terrace doors like a queen approaching her throne. Behind her, she could feel the weight of 2 men's attention, one burning with desire, the other burning with something much more dangerous. And that's when that dark glint appeared in Burton's eyes. The garden behind Aaron Spelling's mansion was designed for seduction. winding pathways lit by discreet lanterns, hidden alcoves surrounded by jasmine and roses. The distant sound of the party muffled by carefully placed hedges that created the illusion of complete privacy. Elizabeth Taylor made her way along the main path, her heels clicking softly on the stone. She had changed the game now, escalated it beyond the simple flirtation that had started in the main room. This was dangerous territory, the kind that ended marriages and destroyed careers if the wrong people found out. But that was what made it exciting. She found the gazebo she remembered from previous parties, tucked away in a corner of the garden where the shadows were deepest, where conversations could not be overheard, where indiscretions could be committed without witnesses. Or so she thought. Alain Delon appeared exactly 5 minutes later, moving through the darkness with that predatory grace that had made him famous. He had removed his jacket somewhere along the way. His white shirt was open at the collar, revealing the strong column of his throat. "You came," Elizabeth said, though she had never doubted he would. "I said I would." He stood in the entrance to the gazebo, not moving closer, still maintaining that maddening distance that made her feel like she was chasing instead of being chased. "Are you always so cautious?" she asked. "Are you always so reckless?" The question was delivered without judgment, but it stung. Because it was accurate. Elizabeth Taylor had built her entire life on reckless choices. Marrying Eddie Fisher while he was still married to her best friend. Stealing Richard Burton from his wife on the set of Cleopatra. Every scandal, every headline, every moment of notoriety had been the result of choosing passion over prudence. "Reckless gets results," she said, moving closer to him. Sometimes it gets you destroyed. Is that a threat?" "It is an observation." She was close enough to touch him now. Close enough to see the faint scar on his chin that makeup had hidden on screen. Close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body. "You know," she said, her voice dropping to that legendary whisper, "most men would have kissed me by now. Most men are not me." "No," she agreed, reaching up to trace that scar with one finger. "They are not." His skin was warm under her touch. She felt him tense slightly, the first crack in that perfect composure, and smiled. Even Alain Delon was not completely immune. "Tell me something," she murmured, her hand sliding down to rest on his chest. "Why did you really come out here?" "Curiosity. About what?" "About whether Elizabeth Taylor is as dangerous as her reputation suggests." She laughed softly, pressing closer until her body was almost touching his. "And what is your conclusion?" "That you are more dangerous than anyone realizes, including yourself." The words should have been insulting. Instead, they were arousing. Because Alain Delon was not trying to flatter her or seduce her or gain something from her. He was simply stating what he saw. And what he saw was a woman who played with fire because she had forgotten it could burn. "Kiss me," she said. It was not a request. Elizabeth Taylor was not accustomed to making requests. It was a command, delivered with all the authority of a woman who had been obeyed by presidents and kings. For a moment, Delon just looked at her. Those ice-blue eyes searching her face for something she could not identify. Then he kissed her. It was not the passionate, overwhelming kiss she had expected. It was controlled, precise. A kiss that took exactly what it wanted and nothing more. His hands remained at his sides. His body stayed perfectly still. Only his mouth moved, claiming hers with a technical perfection that was somehow more erotic than any display of passion could have been. When he pulled away, Elizabeth was breathless, shaken. For the first time in years, she felt like she had been kissed instead of doing the kissing. "Satisfied?" he asked. Before she could answer, before she could process what had just happened, she heard the sound that would change everything. Slow, deliberate applause. Both of them turned toward the sound. There, standing at the edge of the gazebo where the shadows were deepest, was Richard Burton. He was leaning against a stone pillar, a glass of whiskey in one hand, his face completely composed. How long had he been watching? "Bravo," Burton said, his Welsh accent thick with something that might have been amusement or might have been rage. "Quite a performance, darling." Both of you, Elizabeth felt her heart stop. Not because she was afraid she had been caught in worse situations, but because of the look in Richard's eyes. She knew that look. It was the look he got when he was playing Hamlet or Iago or any of the other brilliant, dangerous men who populated Shakespeare's plays. It was the look of a man planning something terrible. "Richard," she began. "No need to explain, my dear. I understand completely." Burton pushed himself off the pillar and walked closer, his movements casual, but somehow threatening. You were conducting an experiment, testing the waters, as it were. Delon had stepped away from Elizabeth the moment Burton appeared, but he showed no sign of embarrassment or fear. If anything, he seemed curious about what would happen next. And you, Monsieur Delon, Burton continued, turning those intelligent eyes on the French actor. I suppose you were conducting your own experiment, seeing what it felt like to kiss another man's wife. Your wife kissed me, Delon replied calmly. I merely responded. Burton smiled a smile that had once charmed audiences from London to Broadway, but now carried undertones of genuine malice. How very continental of you. In Wales, we handle these situations differently. How do you handle them? Delon asked. Patiently. The single word hung in the garden air like a curse. Because anyone who knew Richard Burton understood what that patience meant. He was not a man who acted in anger. He was a man who planned, who calculated, who waited for exactly the right moment to strike back. Elizabeth felt something cold settle in her stomach. She had wanted to hurt Richard, to make him jealous, to win another round in their endless game. But looking at his face now, she realized she might have miscalculated. Richard, darling, she started. Save it, Elizabeth. His voice was still pleasant, conversational even. You have made your point quite eloquently. Both of you have. He finished his whiskey in one swallow and set the glass down on the stone railing of the gazebo. I think I shall return to the party now. People will be wondering where their hosts have gone. He looked directly at Delon. It was educational meeting you, Monsieur Delon. I suspect we shall see each other again. Burton walked away then, disappearing into the shadows as quietly as he had appeared. Elizabeth and Delon stood in silence for several moments, processing what had just happened. You were right, Elizabeth said finally. This was a war one cannot win. The war has not started yet, Delon replied. That was merely the opening move. What do you mean? Delon looked in the direction Burton had gone, his expression thoughtful. Your husband is a very intelligent man, and very patient. Men like that do not seek immediate revenge. They plan something much worse. Worse than what? Something that will destroy you slowly, over years perhaps, so that when the end comes, you will understand exactly why you are being punished. Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the cool night air. What have I done? She whispered. You have started a game with a man who plays chess while you play checkers, Delon said. And now we must all live with the consequences. No one knew that Burton's revenge plan had already begun. What Elizabeth Taylor did not understand, what she could not understand because she had never been a student of human nature, the way Richard Burton was that her husband had been planning this moment for months. The kiss in the garden was not the beginning of the war. It was the excuse Burton had been waiting for. Their marriage had been dying for 2 years. Everyone in Hollywood knew it. The fights were louder, the reconciliations shorter, the periods of silence longer and more bitter. But Burton was too proud to simply divorce her again. Too intelligent to let her win by walking away. He needed her to destroy herself, and tonight she had handed him the weapon. Burton returned to the party with a smile that fooled everyone except the people who knew him best. He moved through the crowd with practiced charm, telling jokes, sharing stories, playing the role of the brilliant Welsh actor who had conquered Hollywood and married its most beautiful woman. But his mind was working, calculating, planning. Within 30 minutes, he had identified his targets. First, Hedda Hopper's assistant, a nervous young woman who hung on every word of gossip because her boss paid handsomely for exclusive information. Burton approached her casually, mentioned that he had seen Elizabeth deep in conversation with that French actor and wondered if anyone else had noticed how attentive they seemed to each other. The seed was planted. Second, a photographer from Life magazine who was covering the party. Burton made sure to position himself where the man could overhear a carefully crafted conversation about European actors and their reputation for sophistication with American women. Nothing direct, nothing actionable, just enough innuendo to make the photographer start paying attention. Third, Aaron Spelling himself, their host. Burton pulled him aside with the concern of a worried husband. Aaron, old boy, I wonder if you might keep an eye on Elizabeth tonight. She has been drinking a bit more than usual, and you know how she can be when she gets impulsive. By the time Elizabeth and Delon returned to the party separately 15 minutes apart, as if that would fool anyone, Burton had laid the groundwork for something much larger than a simple scandal. He was creating a narrative. Elizabeth rejoined the crowd with her famous smile intact, But Burton could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes kept searching for him across the room. She was waiting for the explosion, the confrontation, the dramatic scene that would give her something to react against. It never came. Instead, Burton was the perfect husband for the rest of the evening. Attentive without being possessive. Charming without being desperate. He brought her drinks, introduced her to people, laughed at her jokes. To any outside observer, they looked like the golden couple of Hollywood. But Elizabeth knew better. She could feel something building beneath Richard's perfect performance. Something patient and methodical and infinitely more dangerous than his famous temper. Delon, meanwhile, had positioned himself on the opposite side of the room. He was not hiding. Alain Delon was incapable of hiding, but he was making it clear that whatever had happened in the garden was over. Finished. A moment of mutual curiosity that would not be repeated. But Burton was not interested in what would not be repeated. He was interested in what already had been. At 11:30, he made his excuse to leave. "Elizabeth is tired," he told their host. "Too much champagne, I suspect. You know how these Hollywood parties can be." They drove home in silence. Burton behind the wheel of his Rolls-Royce, Elizabeth staring out the window at the lights of Beverly Hills scrolling past. Waiting for him to say something, anything. He never did. It was not until they were in their Bel Air mansion, not until Elizabeth had removed her jewelry and was preparing for bed, that Burton finally spoke. "Quite an evening," he said conversationally. Elizabeth froze. "Richard, I can explain." "Explain what, darling?" "That you enjoyed a lovely conversation with Monsieur Delon? That you found his observations about American cinema illuminating?" "I saw nothing that required explanation. The words were perfectly reasonable, perfectly innocent, which made them terrifying." "You saw us in the garden," Elizabeth said. "I saw you conducting yourself exactly as I expected you would." Burton was removing his cufflinks. With the same methodical precision he brought to everything. "You are Elizabeth Taylor. You are incapable of being in the same room as an attractive man without testing your power over him. That is not. It is exactly what happened. And it is exactly what I knew would happen when I saw him arrive tonight." Elizabeth felt something cold settle in her chest. "You knew he would be there." Burton smiled, that same pleasant, dangerous smile he had worn in the garden. "My dear Elizabeth, Aaron Spelling does not invite European actors to his parties without a reason. Especially European actors who have no interest in Hollywood fame or American connections. And why was he there? Because I suggested to Aaron that it might be interesting to meet him? Cultural exchange, you understand? Bringing together the old world and the new." The words hit Elizabeth like a physical blow. You set this up? I created an opportunity. You chose how to respond to it." Burton finished undressing and put on his robe. "Just as you always do." Elizabeth sank into the chair beside her vanity table, her mind reeling. This was a trap. This was a test. One you failed spectacularly. What are you going to do? Burton walked to the window and looked out at the lights of Los Angeles spread below them like fallen stars. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "Nothing, my dear. I am going to do absolutely nothing. I do not understand. You will." He turned back to face her, and Elizabeth saw something in his eyes that she had never seen before. Not anger. Not hurt. Something colder. Something final. "You see, Elizabeth, revenge is not about what I do to you. Revenge is about letting you do it to yourself." He walked toward the door of their bedroom, then paused. "Alain Delon is leaving for France tomorrow morning. His business in Hollywood is finished. But yours, my darling, is just beginning." The door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded like a coffin lid falling shut. Elizabeth sat alone in her bedroom, surrounded by the luxury that her beauty and talent had bought, and realized that she had just walked into a trap that had been 40 years in the making. But the truly shocking thing had yet to happen. The revenge that followed was not dramatic, it was not immediate. It was something much worse. It was methodical, patient, and absolutely devastating. Richard Burton understood something about Elizabeth Taylor that she had never understood about herself. Her power came not from her beauty or her talent, but from the myth of Elizabeth Taylor. The legend. The woman who could steal any man, survive any scandal, emerge from any catastrophe more famous than before. Burton was going to destroy the myth. And he was going to make her do it herself. The first phase began within a week of the party. Subtle mentions in gossip columns. Elizabeth Taylor seemed quite taken with French actor Alain Delon at the Spelling soiree. Nothing scandalous. Nothing actionable. Just enough to plant the idea that Hollywood's most famous wife was looking elsewhere. Within a month, the whispers had grown louder. Sources close to the Burtons say Elizabeth has been asking friends about Delon's availability. Still nothing concrete. Still nothing that could be traced back to Richard. Because Richard Burton had learned something during his years in Hollywood, you do not have to create scandals. You just have to let them create themselves. Elizabeth, meanwhile, had tried to contact Delon 3 times since the party. 3 calls to his Paris apartment that went unreturned. 3 messages through mutual acquaintances that received polite but distant responses. The French actor had made it clear that their moment in the garden was exactly that, a moment. Finished. Over. Never to be repeated. But Burton made sure the media did not know that. The second phase came 6 months later. Burton began giving interviews. Thoughtful, philosophical interviews about marriage, about loyalty, about the challenges of loving a woman who was larger than life. Elizabeth is a force of nature, he told Barbara Walters in November 1973. You do not try to control a hurricane. You simply try to survive it. The interview was brilliant, sympathetic. It painted Burton as the long-suffering husband of a woman who could not help her own destructive impulses. It made Elizabeth look reckless, selfish, unworthy of such devotion. Most importantly, it was completely true. The third phase was the cruelest. Burton began being seen with other women. Not actresses or socialites who would create scandals of their own. Intelligent women, writers, academics, women who represented everything Elizabeth was not: subtle, intellectual, content to remain in the background. The message was clear: Richard Burton was moving on. Finding women who appreciated him for his mind rather than competing with him for attention. Elizabeth, desperate and increasingly isolated, made exactly the mistakes Burton had predicted she would make. She drank more. She threw scenes at public events. She gave interviews defending herself against accusations that no one had actually made, which only made her look more guilty. The final phase took 18 months to execute, but it was masterful in its simplicity. Burton filed for divorce in July 1975, not in Hollywood, where Elizabeth's lawyers could create a media circus. Not in New York, where her connections ran deep. In Haiti, where the proceedings could be handled quietly, quickly, and with minimal fuss. The divorce papers cited irreconcilable differences. Nothing about affairs. Nothing about Delon. Nothing that would give Elizabeth ammunition for a counterattack. But by then, the damage was complete. The myth of Elizabeth Taylor had been systematically dismantled. She was no longer the woman who could have any man she wanted. She was the woman who had destroyed her marriage to one of the greatest actors of his generation, because she could not resist flirting with a Frenchman at a party. The press coverage was brutal. Taylor's tragic pattern, Beauty and the Beast of her own making, the fall of a Hollywood legend. Elizabeth tried to fight back. Gave interviews claiming she had been misunderstood, that the stories about Delon were exaggerated, that Richard had been the one who was unfaithful. Nobody believed her, because Richard Burton had spent 2 years carefully building a narrative in which Elizabeth was the villain of her own story. And villains, especially beautiful villains, are never believed when they claim innocence. The most devastating part was that Elizabeth began to believe it herself. She married John Warner in 1976, a quiet politician who represented everything Burton was not: safe, forgettable, completely uninterested in the spotlight. The marriage was a disaster from the beginning, but it served Burton's purpose perfectly. It made Elizabeth look desperate, willing to settle for anyone who would have her. Meanwhile, Burton returned to the theater, won critical acclaim, reminded the world that he was one of the greatest classical actors of his generation. He was no longer Elizabeth Taylor's husband. He was Richard Burton, artist. The transformation was complete. In 1979, Alain Delon gave an interview to Paris Match about his Hollywood experiences. The interviewer asked about Elizabeth Taylor. "A beautiful woman?" Delon said diplomatically. "But America makes legends of people who should simply be allowed to be human. The pressure of maintaining such myths destroys everyone it touches. Did you ever regret meeting her?" Delon considered the question carefully. "I regret that she was used as a weapon in someone else's war. That is not the fate any woman deserves, no matter how famous she becomes." The interview was buried in the French press. But those who read it understood what Delon was really saying. Elizabeth Taylor had been destroyed not by her own choices, but by someone who knew exactly how to manipulate those choices. Richard Burton died in 1984, 9 years after their divorce. Elizabeth attended the funeral. She stood in the back wearing black, saying nothing. When someone asked her what she was thinking about, she gave an answer that shocked everyone who heard it. "I was thinking about a garden in Beverly Hills," she said. And how different everything might have been if I had simply stayed inside that night. Years later, after Elizabeth's own death in 2011, Burton's personal papers were discovered in his Swiss estate. Among them was a journal entry dated March 16, 1973, the day after the spelling party. It read, "The trap is set. Elizabeth has taken the bait. Now I must simply wait for her to destroy herself. It will take years, but she will do it. She cannot help herself. That is both her greatest strength and her ultimate weakness." The final sentence was the most chilling. "I loved her too much to kill her quickly. So I will let her die slowly instead." 40 years later, what Taylor said about Burton shocked everyone. "Richard won the war by making me fight myself. He was the only man who ever understood that my greatest enemy was not him, it was me." Tell us in the comments. Is revenge or forgiveness more powerful? Which is more valuable?